Okay, ready? Yeah. Okay, so books. Oh yeah, hi those of you watching the video. This is Noodles the puppy. You'll meet him. He's very good and a little bit naughty, but we're letting him hang out right now, but I might kick him out anyway. So yeah, books. There's a suggested reading list. You're not required to get anything, but you can really learn a lot through books. I'm a big reader. I'm also a compulsive book collector. So yeah, this list is huge, and if you manage to like go through all of the books on this list, and and nothing else is your education, like you'd be a pretty good artist. But yeah, nothing is required. If you were going to get like 1 or 2 books for this program, it would be some from this first section that I'm going to talk about. So this is Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, often just called Pojar. People often refer to this because it's just Pojar, which the authors are Pojar and McKinnon. There's a great, picture-heavy field guide to the plants of the Pacific Northwest. It's mostly about botany and identifying the plants, and it's not really about like medicine, and it's all plants. It's not just medicinal plants. However, Nancy Turner, is that her name? Yeah, Nancy Turner is one of the authors of this book. There's like 10. There's a lot of them. And Nancy Turner is one of the authors, and Nancy Turner is really cool. She's an ethnobotanist. She works up in Victoria, BC, and she's a white botanist that has like very strong connections to the like tribal peoples in the area in which she works, and she's lived and worked in those communities and has like written a bunch of books about the ethnobotany of like this area, kind of northwesty Turtle Island. So a lot of the plants that do have some like medicinal utility, they do at least briefly touch upon that. And I think that's Nancy Turner. So this is a great book. Nice to have out in the field. It's designed to get rained on and not fall apart. That's a really good one. In terms of like field guides with medicinal uses, I'm still taught, these are like the books that I would suggest if you're just going to get a few books. You could get both of these or one of them. So Medicinal Plants of the Pacific West by Michael Moore. This is like a classic. This probably came out in the 90s. 93. So Michael Moore is a very well-known herbalist, West Coast, like white herbalist. He started the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, which kind of like the generation of herbalists that's like a little bit older than me, almost all trained with Michael Moore. So like, who's some famous herbalists? Like 7 Song trained with Michael Moore. I don't know. I won't try to rattle them off, but basically like Michael Moore had a huge influence on West Coast herbalism, like West Coast hippie herbalism or whatever. He wrote a bunch of books. Here's another one of his books, Medicinal Plants of the Mountain West. He has several more. He was originally trained, he lived mostly in the southwest part of the country. He was originally trained by like curanderos, Mexican curanderos. His first book is just about like curandera herbs. I forget what it's called. It's very good. But then he just like really started studying both on his own and with friends. And he was just like kind of a genius, or he was originally a musician. He had a very interesting brain. And so he kind of developed his own system of herbalism. And he wrote a bunch of books about plants. He was a wildcrafter. He grew plants. He had a practice, and he was a teacher. He's dead. He died like 10 years ago or something. Yeah, he died. He had kidney failure, and he was doing dialysis. You can do like at-home dialysis. But he was so impassioned about teaching herbs that he often would be like traveling and teaching and kind of like doing his at-home dialysis in less than ideal circumstances. And I have heard that he probably like died earlier than he had to, just due to his passion about getting that information out. But also, if you go to the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine website, all of his material that he ever made is on there for free now. So you can there's like a mail order course that he used to do, and etc. And you can just get all of that. It's all free. It's really good information. So he has this book, Medicinal Plants of the Pacific West. This covers all the plants that we'll talk about in this program or in this book. And it's not super well in terms of like using it as a visual ID. The pictures are okay. And there's line drawings of each of the plants. My friend Mimi Camp made these line drawings. She's really cool. She lives down in Bisbee, Arizona. But the information in this book is really good. So like he talks about where you can find the plants and how to collect them in a good way. He often talks about propagation. He definitely talks about scarcity or not scarcity and how to be like careful in your harvest. And he goes over how to prepare them and how to work with them as medicines. And he was very much like a clinical herbalist, and so his information on how to work with the plants as medicine is really strong, really good. So yeah, I really like this book for all those reasons, or any of his books are like really good. There's also, so this is a newer book, Pacific Northwest Medicinal Plants. This is by Scott Close, who's like my dear friend and teacher. And I love him very much. This just came out a few years ago. My copy is signed by Scott. And this is a beautiful book, and it's super well illustrated. Lots of photos, really close-up photos of the plants. So this is like a really, really, really good one to identify stuff in the field. It has all the plants that are in the Michael Moore book and then some. There's like a lot of plants in this book. The picking tips are really good. The propagation tips are really good. I do think like Scott primarily has been like a wildcrafter, and he's really like a plant spirit kind of guy. And he is not primarily a clinician. And so there are like medicinal uses of the plants in this book, and they are good and fine, but they are not as detailed as the descriptions in Michael Moore's books. And so these two like work really well together. And I don't mean to like, and they are good, and you could like definitely use the descriptions in this book as like a starting point. But Michael Moore has more of like a depth of knowledge, of practical hands-on knowledge. But this is a great book. I really suggest it. So yeah, if I was you, I would get one or two of these like field guides. And then just in terms of like making medicine, there's this book, which is just called Making Plant Medicine, by Rico Check. He is one of the founders of Horizon Herbs, aka Herb Farm, like the tinctures you can buy everywhere with the yellow labels with the green lettering on them. And so the Herb Farm and Horizon Herbs kind of work together. They have a huge herb farm in southern Oregon, and Rico has dedicated his life to like learning how to grow medicinal plants. So this is just a great book in really simple, easy to follow language on like how to make a tincture, how to make a fresh tincture, how to make a dry tincture, how to make an infused oil, how to make a salve, la la la, like all of this kind of stuff. And then it also has a nice materia medica that covers a lot of the basic herbs and how to grow them, harvest them, tincture them, all of this kind of stuff. Also, it's very his daughter illustrated the book with these little mice, and the illustrations are very cute. I don't have a copy, but I really want to get. Rico Check also has a book called like Growing at-Risk Medicinal Herbs or something like this. It's kind of expensive. I think this might be out of print too and is becoming more expensive or harder to find, but it's really worth it. And the At-Risk Medicinal Herbs book is also a little expensive, but is really good. And so yeah, he's dedicated like a lot of his life to learning how to grow plants that people have trouble growing. Like I know Rico grows OSHA, which is like notoriously difficult to cultivate in a garden. He's got OSHA patches, and that's a good book to get into. Let's learn about growing herbs. So yeah, that's like in terms of practicalities. I think that propagation is really important. We'll talk a lot about propagation, and a big part of my philosophy with this school is I really try to teach people how to propagate the plants, both like garden plants in your own garden and the wild plants, like out in the wilds. Wildcrafting is complicated and can be bad. I think like climate change is real. Deforestation is real. You know, there's like a lot of pressures on the environment, and there's a lot of pressures on the wild plants. And one of those pressures is herbalism. So we'll be talking a lot about wildcrafting and wildcrafting ethics, but like there's definitely a trend of herbalists like doing damage to the wild populations of herbs. Michael Moore noticed this a lot over the course of his career, and he was pretty like willy-nilly about wildcrafting. And he was working a lot with desert herbs, and those herbs in general are like slower growing and more sensitive. But like my understanding is some of the patches of herbs that he brought students to over his career, by the end of his career, didn't exist anymore. Like they just got picked out. And so like, you know, the pattern is this, like the teacher brings the students to the patch of herbs. They pick some herbs. One or two of those students like become an herbalist and come back to that patch and pick the herbs. Maybe one of them starts an herb school and they bring their students to that patch and they pick the herbs. And like no one person, you know, like gets really wild and like picks everything out, but just over time the patch will get picked out. So this is also a good moment to say that part of me, I'm going to bring you to some patches of herbs that I've been working with for many years, and I just respectfully ask that everyone not go back to those places. I bring people to them every year, and it's just really important to me to like steward them. I'll be clear when we're in different places. Like there's some places that like the herb is very abundant and it's a well-known spot, but there's other places that are like whatever my spots, you know, or that I bring people to, and so it's a discussion. But in general, like I hope that I'll teach people how to find the herbs themselves rather than going back to the places that I bring you to. Also, so learning plant propagation and learning how to like expand the wild patches is really important and is a big part of what I teach in this program, and I hope that we'll do a lot of it together. And I really like my like larger dream in the herbalism culture that I'm trying to influence is like when people start learning about herbs, like they will be actively propagating herbs out in the wild, maybe even before they start like harvesting for medicine. I think like if that became more of a backbone of the herbal culture, it would really change things a lot. So I'm really inspired by indigenous cultures in general of this area, and it's always a good time to mention that yes, we're always on tribal land. This land is sold. We're on Chehalis land right now. I didn't even mention that yet. So the indigenous cultures of this area have a long history, and still to this day have a strong culture of like working with the wild food and medicine plants to help them be more abundant, as opposed to like exploitively extracting them. So those traditions are really good to learn about in terms of the philosophy and the practicalities of how to keep the wild plants alive. So here's a good book called Keeping It Living. This is by Nancy Turner, that ethnobotanist I was talking about earlier. Well, I'll pass around. You can all like look at the books afterwards. And so this is about specifically how the peoples of Northwest America propagated medicinal and food plants in very practical ways. So it's a little bit dense. It's definitely like academia writing, but this is a good source of information on how to do plant propagation. This is called Propagation of Pacific Northwest Native Plants, which is exactly what it says. This is more like intended for like nursery, people who run nurseries. But this covers, it's not just medicinal plants, it's all sorts of plants. But it really covers in-depth propagation techniques for different native plants. And we'll go over this book more later. There's a lot of books that are like more about kind of the philosophy. So there's a lot of different ways to like, so I think I referenced on an online thread Skeeter or Michael Pilarski. He's a local herbalist. He lives up on the peninsula. And I don't know how easy this book is to get anymore, but it's called Growing and Wildcrafting Medicinal Plants in the Pacific Northwest, and that's what it's about. And so it's just Skeeter from his like personal experience over the years. He's a wildcrafter, he's a farmer, he does a lot of plant propagation, and he's a permaculturalist, and he's in his like 70s now, and he's been running this company called Friends of the Trees since like the 70s or the 60s or something. So he's been doing this work for a long time. And so this is just some information about medicinal herbs, how to grow them, how to harvest them, how to propagate them, things like this. It's a really good one. It's kind of hard to find, and this is like hyper local. Like this is about right where we live. And then in terms of like philosophical books, there's a lot of different like styles of herbalism, or all different cultures all over the world have different ways that they work with herbs. I think it's really valuable to look at herbalism from a lot of different directions. So some kind of like books that are just not exactly like practical, this is like how you pick this, etc. sort of books, but just like different ways that different peoples look at herbs. This book is called Healing with Herbs and Rituals, and this is about like Mexican curandera traditions. This book does have a materia medica that's about specific plants and how to work with them. But it's also just about, that curandero tradition down in northern Mexico, which is so beautiful and it's very much like a spiritual practice. And some of the practitioners just have these like really beautiful and amazing practices where like one of these people, they're almost like saints. Like one of these people primarily heals with mud, or they all heal through God basically, but like one of these people primarily heals with mud. You go to see them, he talks to you for a little bit, and then he like covers you with mud, and like that's it, and people are like healed by these practices. This book also covers Teresita, who is this curandera who lived in the early 1900s. And I don't know where my copy of this book is, but I would strongly suggest reading a book called The Hummingbird's Daughter, which is written by one of Teresita's ancestors, and it's about her life. And it's just like beautiful. It kind of reads like magical realism. It's like a really beautiful book. It reads like a novel, but it's a true story. And it's about her experience growing up and being trained as an herbalist. And yeah, it's a lot about her plants, learning how to talk to plants, learning how to heal people. And yeah, she like performs miracles. So I'm really into the curandero tradition. Oh, this is a book I like very much. It's called Pharmacopoeia. It's by an author named Dale Pendle. He died just a few years ago. And this book is essentially about psychoactive plants and just drugs. It's essentially a book about drugs. And it's written very beautifully. Like he is a poet primarily, and he was a botanist. And he like there's a trilogy. There's 3 books. This one covers like kind of narcotic herbs, like tobacco, poppies, wine. The second book is about stimulating herbs and chemicals, and the third book is about psychedelic herbs and chemicals. They're all really good. And he just has a strong. He works with the plant spirits. He clearly has ingested everything that he talks about in these books, and he is really good at kind of like plants communication or plants like mediumship, and basically like he did a lot of the writing about the plants when the plants were in his bodies, and so it's just like a really interesting way that he kind of brought the plants through. And yeah, he basically has this like spiritual practice which he calls the poison path, which is basically about like ingesting herbs and learning from them. That if I had to define my spiritual path, that's the closest that I could come. Animist, he's kind of an animist, all things are alive. So that's a really great book. Stephen Herod Buhner, like a lot of people kind of know. I have some mild critiques of him, but mostly I really love him. He's still alive. You can find him on Facebook. He's a nice guy. This book, The Secret Teachings of Plants, is basically about like plant and human communication. So it's 2 parts. The first part is like very sciencey, and it's about the heart, the human heart as an organ of perception, and the ways in which you can entrain like human bodies entrain on one another. Like if you're snuggling with your lover or your kid, like your heart will start beating at the same speed, and just the ways that communication happens on like a physiological level as opposed to spoken word. And then that goes on into the ways in which plants and humans can communicate with one another in a physiological way. And then the second half of the book is very poetic and is about like plant spirits, communicating with plant spirits. He was clearly influenced by Dale Pendle. He is writing in the second part. Like Dale really likes to do these. There's like parts of the book that are written in italics, and that's basically like the plant spirits speaking. And Stephen Herod Buhner does the same stuff. So yeah, The Secret Teaching of Plants is really good and can be really inspiring in terms of talking to plants. This is Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm. He wrote a bunch of books, and they're all good and like inspiring and philosophically really interesting. I think he was a little, like some of his early books I feel like are a little bit appropriative of native cultures, but he wrote them a long time ago, and it's complicated, but I have some slight critiques of Stephen Herod Buhner, although mostly I really love him. He also wrote several books. He's done a lot of research into specific ailments and how to work with herbs around them. Like he has a book on Lyme's disease, working with Lyme's disease, which is super good. He has a book on like men's health, especially like as men are getting older, like adrenopause, that's super good. He's recently done a lot of research into emphysema and like COPD, And yeah, so a lot of his research is really good. This is an older book, The Metamorphosis of Plants. This is by Goethe, who wrote Faust. So he was a German philosopher who lived, I don't know, 1800s maybe, 1700s. And this is basically like him philosophically writing about plants and how they grow and why they have the forms that they do. It's not really about plant medicines, it's just about plants as organisms. It's really beautiful. Oh, this is Cohosh. Hi, Cohosh. Hi, get out of here, dogs. I have two. Yeah, I'm also trying to like. A lot of the herb books that we have available to us are written by white men mostly, and so a couple years ago I tried really hard to expand the types of books and authors that I'm covering. And of course, like, indigenous herbal traditions on this continent are like so rich and beautiful and have been largely suppressed and in many ways lost, but there are still really strong traditions and a lot of people are still keeping that knowledge. So these two books, so this book, Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask, by Mary Sisseb Genius, is a beautiful book. It's about this lady, I really can't pronounce her first name, Kiwe Dinokwe, who is an Anishinaabe herbalist, so like from the Great Lakes region, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This lady's really cool. So this book, Cedar Songs, is really cool. This is her autobiography, and it is about her. She was raised on a reservation and trained as an herbalist by her elders, and then she went on to get a PhD in, I think, ethnobotany. Sorry, she got her master's, and she was a teacher for many years, mostly teaching about plants. And she's just super cool lady, and this is a great book about how she was trained, her experiences of being trained, and like her technique of working with plants, and just like an inspiring. She is a single mom. She did a bunch of different jobs. You know, she just had a really interesting life. And at one point, like when she was teaching in the college, one of her colleagues was like, "Oh, Indians can't live off the land anymore. It's not even possible." And she took offense to that. She was in her like 40s or 50s. So she went to an island in one of the lakes where her people had been spending time forever, and she just lived there, lived off the land for I think a summer or a year, just to prove this guy wrong. In the process, she broke her leg, like getting out of a boat or something. Yeah, again, this is a lady in her 40s or 50s, set the leg herself, splinted it, it healed, and just continued to live on the island, etc. So she's really cool. Yeah, Cedar Songs is just about her life. But her kid went on to make this book, which is a very like practical book. It has a lot of materia medica and a lot of philosophy and a lot of just beautiful stories about the herbal tradition of the Anishinaabe. It's really good. And then no, sorry. Then this person is, I think, this person's kid. And here at this book, Our Knowledge is Not Primitive, which is about like Anishinaabe indigenous herbal knowledge and like how to decolonize those teachings. It's basically a book about the validity of those teachings and how to like honor them and bring them into like dominant culture in a way that is like good and healthy, and also just about how colonization like changed and influenced and affected like those lineages of knowledge and how to kind of reclaim them. It's very good. It's super academic and kind of a hard read. but it's really like valuable stuff to think about. Yeah, that's a good one. This book, Working Cures, is about African herbalism, specifically like the African diaspora during slavery. It's essentially about like slave herbalism, like black people's herbalisms during the time of slavery, and so like it's about like traditional African knowledge, the trauma of coming over as slaves, and how that knowledge had to like go into hiding and also kind of become syncretic with the dominant culture, and a lot of that like a lot of like Appalachian herbalism has like a really strong African element to it that often isn't like talked about. You know, like high blood, low blood, blood cleansers, like a lot of those concepts that people associate with like Appalachian herbalism. A lot of that is from African traditions. And so this book is about, this book is of course heartbreaking to read in many places, and it's about like African cultures under slavery. It's about herbalism as resistance. It's about like healing as resistance, and the ways in which like those traditions and cultures like held on and like made it through this like brutal period of oppression. And yeah, it's really good. It's really interesting. This book isn't about herbs, but it's called Native Peoples of the Olympic Peninsula, Who We Are, and it was written by Native Peoples of the Olympic Peninsula. It's not like a book written about the Native Peoples of the Olympic Peninsula. And so like all of the again, everywhere is native land, is everywhere that we're going to go is tribal land. And so I will try to talk about whose tribal land we're on when we're in the different places that we're going to. So like, yeah, we're on Chehalis land now. We're going to Nisqually land tomorrow, where we spend a lot of time on Skokomish land. And this is just a really good book about I think it's like 12 different tribes up on the peninsula, and like their history, colonization, and like where they are today. And it's a really good read, and I think just really important information to like learn about these communities, which are still so vibrant and present with us now. I'm really interested in Chinese medicine, Chinese herbalism. I'm like mildly studying Chinese herbalism. I hope to study acupuncture someday. I'm trying to get the money together to go to school. But yeah, so yeah, Chinese herbal medicine is like a really rich and beautiful tradition. And it's the oldest herbal books that still exist are from the Chinese tradition. Like the Divine Farmers Materia Medica, I think was written thousands of years ago. I have to double check that. But so there's like a very strong lineage of herbal medicine within Chinese culture, as there are in all cultures. But it's just very well documented, and then of course has become like really integrated, like kind of all over the world in like TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, which in a lot of ways is kind of a colonized medical system, or like so Mao Zedong during the revolution, kind of like, because like Chinese medicine, you know, China's a big place and there's a lot of medicine traditions within China, and so like during the Cultural Revolution, TCM was sort of developed to like modernize, take all of the various like Chinese medicines and kind of like make them into one thing and make it more modern and make it kind of more acceptable to whatever like the Western mindset or the modern world. So TCM is cool, and also there's like a lot more to Chinese medicine than that. But the Chinese ways of looking at plants and looking at people, so like the 5 element system, for example, their diagnostic systems, you know, in terms of like pulses and face diagnostics, tongue diagnostics, are super work very well, are super useful. And like matching plants with people, a lot of the systems for matching plants with symptoms and matching plants with body types are really useful. So I'd encourage like studying that system in general. There's a lot of other Chinese medicine books on the list, but I really like these books specifically. This is The Energetics of Western Herbs by Peter Holmes. And so this guy is an American. He studied in China, he studied around here, and he applied the Chinese energetic system of like putting herbs into categories, into energetic categories, to herbs that grow wild in the Americas, on Turtle Island, whatever, and to like other European herbs that are worked with a lot within traditions in this area. So this is a nice one to like it. One of the challenges for me, I like to work with herbs that grow around me, and so one of the challenges for me with studying Chinese medicine is like I don't know those herbs really, or I just read about them in books, but I don't really get to meet them. But these books are a really good way where you can look at the herbs that grow here. Like a lot of the herbs that we will look at in this program are in these books, and he talks about them using like that TCM language and elemental system. So these are really good, 2 volumes. And yeah, if you're more into like science-y, or you know, whatever Western science-y chemistry kind of frames, which I am into, or I'm into all of these things, but there's a lot of ways to look at herbs. This book is called Medical Herbalism by David Hoffman. He lives in California. He still practices and teaches. And this looks at herbs more in like a chemotaxonomical kind of way. So like it looks at herbs in terms of their like chemical content, essentially. Phytochemical content. And so it's very much like kind of medical talk. It's very much chemical talk. And it covers a lot of the herbs that we'll talk about, and it's very like sciencey, nitty-gritty, like this phytochemical interacts with this receptor within the human body and like makes this thing happen, which is valuable information, and it's well written. It's pretty easy to read. I mean, it's definitely like some people don't find it easy to read, but I find his techniques really useful. And also he just gets into like, I think the thing with like Chinese medicine also, or a lot of other systems, is sometimes like the language about specific health conditions can be hard to kind of translate, since we've all been raised with more like Western medical terminology. And so like this book is nice because, you know, here, herbs for bleeding gums, herbs for headache, herbs for hemorrhoids, herbs for hypertension. You know, it's like, it's just very much like words that your doctor would use to you about specific ailments, and so he just covers that stuff in a pretty like easy to read way. So that's a good book. This book is called Herbal Constituents. This is by Lisa Ganora, who currently runs the Colorado School of Medical Herbalism, which used to be the Paul Bergner School. It's called the North American Institute of Medical Herbalism, which is a great school. Paul Bergner currently lives in Portland. I'm just going to plug him. He's a great teacher. He is kind of in the vitalist tradition, and he's a very sciencey guy. He's a great researcher. He's a great teacher. I would highly recommend. Paul Bergner has a series of like recorded lectures. It used to be the mail order part of his school. He doesn't run that school anymore. You can buy these things from him, and it's like 8 hours of lectures on like insulin resistance, which is like diabetes, pre-diabetes. 8 hours on like materia medica, 8 hours on hypertension. You know, he just really goes in depth. He's a very experienced clinician, and I don't have any books here by him. I would suggest looking him up and looking up this material he's put out. It's all really good. But this Lisa Ganora, she taught in that school with him, and she's a chemist. So this book is called Herbal Constituents, Foundations of Phytochemistry, and it's about phytochemistry, which is like the chemistry of plants. And so depending on who you are, you might find this hard to read, a lot of molecular structures in there. But in terms of books that are specifically about phytochemistry, this is a pretty readable book about phytochemistry if you're interested in that. And it just covers a lot of the stuff I'll talk about in the phytochemistry class is in this book. It just looks at the different families of molecular compounds that live in plants and like what they do in the human body, basically. So this is a good one. And alchemy, if you're into alchemy, I'm kind of into alchemy, which is like a really kind of an old tradition, mostly from Europe, although it actually originally was developed in the Arabian Peninsula, maybe coming from Africa. I mean, the Arabian Peninsula kind of is Africa. Anyway, it's a very old tradition, kind of like, I feel like there's like a story that like alchemy was nonsense and then it turned into chemistry, which is like a real thing, and that alchemy was just about trying to turn lead into gold and was like kind of a big fraud. But alchemy also has a really strong herbal aspect to it, and so there was like three kind of stages in studying alchemy. First, you would work with, it was called the vegetable work, you would work with herbs, and that was a lot about medicine making and healing, and the whole thing is about medicine making and healing. Then you'd work with the minerals, which yes was about turning lead into gold, but also was about working with minerals to learn about them and for their healing stuff. And the final stage is animals, working with animals, which like included like the creation, it's called the homonucleus, the creation of living organisms from rainwater using lab techniques. And yeah, alchemy is really interesting, and I do think that the alchemical medicinal preparations of like spagyrics, working with spagyrics, which is a very involved process of making plant extracts, and it's a lot about astrology, and it's a lot about some specific like laboratory workings. It's very much a spiritual system also, where you're like working on yourself at the same time you're working on the plants. It's a beautiful system. It's really nice to work with, and it's a nice like marriage of science and spirituality in a way that I really like. So this book is called The Practical Handbook of Plant Alchemy, and it's basically about how to make alchemical preparations out of plants. It's a lot of books about alchemy are also kind of like woo-woo new age nonsense, using alchemy as like a kind of framework that you then just fill up with a bunch of fluff, new age fluff. And that's fine, although not really what I'm into. But this book is about like how to make alchemical preparations like straight up in the lab. And it is also about the spiritual aspect and the astrological aspect of doing it, but it's also about like distillation and etc. And I really like this book. I would recommend this book. I would also recommend, I didn't bring it out because it's too many books to carry, but there's a teacher and author named Robert Allen Bartlett. I'll talk about him more on the Phytochemistry Day when I will also discuss alchemy more. So like there's a lineage of alchemy that made it here to the States, that can follow itself back to probably Arabia. And gosh, it's not going to come to me now, but anyway, an alchemist who trained in Europe came to the States, started an alchemy college called the Paracelsus Research Institute that was in Utah. Robert Allen Butler studied there under this guy, and he currently lives in Marysville, Washington. And so he is very much an alchemist. He wrote a book called Real Alchemy, the final chapter of which is a step-by-step guide for turning lead into gold, for whatever that's worth. He's a very nice guy. He still teaches classes. You can study the vegetable aspect, the plant aspect of alchemy with him. It's like a 4-day long intensive. He does it every spring. I haven't done it yet, but I keep meaning to. Yeah, and he has several books that are worth looking into. Yeah, there's a lot more books on this list, and I just don't have time to blabber on about all of them. And one more. So, I don't have this in a hard copy, but there's the King's American Dispensatory is one of many books written by essentially like the eclectics, which were the kind of like the beginnings of naturopathy in America in like the 1800s. Kind of there is a period in time in which kind of like herbalism and like whatever Western medicine were both very viable options. And it's kind of a weird history, and at a certain point like the herbalists got turned into quacks, and the American Medical Association like just went with the doctors or the Western medicine or whatever. But there was a period of time where herbalism was very much like a very respected medical institution, and there's a lot of really good books, both materia medicas and about like diagnostics and how to work with people from that era. They're hard to find in hard copy, but I have most of them in electronic copies, and I will either put them on the Discord as copies, or I will link to a website where you can like download all of them. And those are really good to look through. They talk, and they were mostly working with American herbs, or herbs that grow here. So yeah, King's American Dispensatory especially is a very good one. And you can reference a lot of the herbs that we'll be talking about. You can reference in there, and they just have a interesting way of looking at herbs. Yeah, that's all the books I'm going to talk about. I think you could stop there. Thank you.